You got 5 seconds to move before military police drag you out of here. The voice cracked through the storm-filled night like a steel cable snapping under pressure. Corporal Ryan Mercer stood beneath the harsh white floodlights outside Hangar 12, rainwater dripping from the brim of his patrol cap as cold wind pushed across the tarmac in violent bursts. Behind him, the massive doors of the restricted drone hangar stood partially open, spilling pale fluorescent light across the soaked concrete. The smell of jet fuel, hydraulic fluid, and wet metal hung thick in the air. A classified MQ-9 combat drone rested inside the hangar like some giant sleeping predator, surrounded by engineers and technicians moving with nervous urgency. But Mercer's attention was fixed on the old man sitting beside a cargo crate near the outer wall. The stranger looked like he belonged anywhere except a military installation. His gray beard was uneven, his weathered parka stained from years of hard use, and a faded canvas bag rested quietly beside his boots. Rain tapped steadily against the old man's shoulders, but he didn't seem to notice. He simply sat there with his hands folded calmly together, pale blue eyes fixed somewhere beyond the roaring runway lights. Mercer let out a sharp laugh and glanced back toward the 2 younger Marines standing near the security gate. I swear they just let anybody wander onto base these days. The others chuckled. One of them adjusted the sling on his rifle while watching the old man with open disgust. Probably another homeless drifter looking for heat, he muttered. The old man finally lifted his gaze. Slow. Steady. Calm in a way that immediately irritated Mercer more than fear ever could. Most civilians panicked when confronted by armed Marines near restricted airspace. This one barely blinked. Thunder rolled low across the Texas sky. Somewhere deeper inside the hangar, an alarm chirped twice before cutting off again. Mercer stepped closer, boots splashing through shallow puddles. You deaf, old-timer, he barked. This area's restricted. You can't sleep here. The old man looked past him toward the open hangar doors. Toward the drone. Toward the cluster of engineers arguing beneath the harsh fluorescent glow. His expression didn't change. Birds grounded, he said quietly. His voice was rough with age, low like gravel dragged across concrete. Mercer frowned. What? The old man tilted his head slightly toward the hangar. Fuel relay lag. Startup sequence keeps cycling. One of the Marines snorted. Yeah, okay, Grandpa. Mercer smirked, but something cold brushed the back of his neck. Not fear. Irritation. The kind that came when someone sounded too calm in a place designed to intimidate people. Behind them, the wind howled across the runway fencing. Rain rattled against the metal siding of the hangar in sharp bursts. Inside, several technicians suddenly erupted into louder shouting. A wrench clattered across concrete. System reset it again, someone yelled. Mercer looked back briefly toward the commotion, then returned his attention to the old man. You some kind of mechanic now? He asked sarcastically. The old man slowly stood up. He was taller than Mercer expected. Thin, but not weak. The kind of posture old combat veterans carried long after age took everything else from them. His eyes drifted once more toward the drone resting inside the hangar shadows. Then back to Mercer. Used to work around aircraft, he answered. Mercer laughed again, louder this time. No kidding. What did you do, mop floors? Another rumble of thunder rolled overhead. Floodlights flickered against sheets of rain. The old man reached down calmly for the faded canvas bag at his feet. One of the younger Marines shifted uneasily without understanding why. There was something wrong about the silence surrounding the stranger. Something heavy hiding beneath it. Mercer folded his arms across his chest and grinned. All right then, homeless man, he said. Let's hear it. What was your MOS? The old man looked directly into his eyes for the first time. No anger. No shame. Just an old exhaustion that somehow carried more weight than shouting ever could. His answer came soft enough to almost disappear beneath the storm. Reaper storm. The wind kept moving. The rain kept falling. But inside Hangar 12, every sound suddenly seemed to die. For 3 long seconds, nobody inside Hangar 12 moved. The storm outside continued hammering the runway with cold Texas rain, and the steady hum of fluorescent lights buzzed faintly overhead, but every conversation near the drone maintenance platform had stopped cold. Corporal Ryan Mercer stared at the old man with a confused grin still frozen halfway across his face. "What kind of MOS is that supposed to be?" he scoffed finally. "That some homeless guy fantasy roleplay thing?" None of the other Marines laughed this time. Staff Sergeant Noah Briggs had gone completely still near the maintenance console 20 feet away. The color slowly drained from his face as he looked at Ethan Cole with the same expression men reserved for unexploded ordnance. One of the civilian engineers glanced between them awkwardly before turning back toward the grounded drone sitting beneath the massive overhead gantry. The aircraft looked menacing even while dormant. Gray composite wings stretched nearly 60 feet beneath the harsh white lighting, armed sensor pods hanging motionless beneath the fuselage like silent eyes. Yet despite 6 hours of diagnostics, the aircraft still refused to complete startup procedures. Every system check returned green. Every circuit passed inspection. And still the drone remained dead. Briggs swallowed hard and walked toward Mercer quickly. "Corporal," he muttered quietly, "step away from him." Mercer blinked. "Excuse me?" Briggs kept his eyes locked on Ethan. "I said step away from him." The tension in his voice was enough to make the younger Marines exchange uncertain looks. Mercer frowned immediately. "What is your problem?" Briggs ignored him completely. His attention stayed fixed on the old veteran standing beneath the rain-streaked floodlights with the canvas bag hanging quietly from one shoulder. Ethan looked exhausted. Not weak. Just tired in a way that felt permanent. Briggs had seen that look before. Usually in old combat photographs hanging inside briefing rooms. Men who had spent too many years carrying things nobody else could see. A gust of cold wind swept through the open hangar doors, carrying the smell of rainwater and jet exhaust deeper into the building. Somewhere above them, steel support beams groaned softly as thunder rolled across the base again. Mercer shook his head with growing irritation. "Come on, Staff Sergeant. You cannot seriously be buying this nonsense." Briggs lowered his voice further. "You do not understand what you just heard." Mercer folded his arms. "Yeah. Enlighten me." Briggs hesitated. Even saying the words felt dangerous somehow. Reaper Storm was not an MOS. The sentence landed heavy between them. Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but Briggs continued before he could. It was a classified operational designation attached to early autonomous strike testing after Desert Storm. Nobody talks about it anymore because officially half the program never existed. One of the younger Marines let out a nervous laugh. "That sounds like conspiracy garbage." Briggs did not even look at him. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan. "My first deployment instructor mentioned it one time during electronic warfare training. Said there were ghost operators running prototype drone missions before the public even knew armed UAVs existed." Mercer snorted. "And this guy is supposed to be one of them?" Ethan said nothing. He simply looked toward the grounded drone again. The harsh white light reflected faintly in his pale blue eyes. Inside the hangar, another engineer suddenly cursed loudly. Fuel pressure dropped again, someone shouted from beneath the aircraft. "It keeps resetting itself." Mercer rolled his eyes and gestured toward the chaos inside. "See that? Real Marines are working in there, not whatever bedtime story you are inventing." Ethan's gaze drifted calmly across the aircraft. He listened for several seconds. Not watching. Listening. Then he spoke quietly. "Starboard relay is overheating during sequence transfer." The nearest engineer looked up instantly. "What?" Ethan pointed toward a sealed access panel beneath the drone's forward intake assembly. Thermal lag starts 30 seconds before ignition cycle. You are chasing software. Problem is mechanical. Silence swept across the hangar again. One technician frowned and checked his tablet rapidly. Another moved toward the access panel Ethan had indicated. Mercer laughed nervously now, but there was less confidence behind it. Briggs could feel the atmosphere changing around them like pressure building before lightning strikes. And somewhere deep inside the command offices above the hangar floor, a secure military server had just flagged the words Reaper Storm for priority review. The technician kneeling beneath the drone removed the maintenance panel with shaking hands. Rain hammered against the runway outside while cold fluorescent light spilled across the polished concrete floor of Hangar 12. Every person nearby seemed to lean closer at the exact same moment. The atmosphere had changed completely now. The jokes were gone. The casual arrogance had vanished beneath something heavier. Uncertainty. The young technician aimed a flashlight inside the narrow compartment and immediately froze. "No way," he whispered. Another engineer pushed beside him. "What is it?" The flashlight beam revealed a relay housing darkened by excessive heat. One of the internal connectors had warped slightly beneath repeated startup cycles. Tiny traces of smoke residue stained the edge of the component. The engineer stared at it in disbelief. "We missed this 6 times, he muttered. Briggs slowly exhaled through his nose. Across the hangar floor, Ethan Cole stood motionless beside the cargo crate, rainwater still dripping from the shoulders of his old parka. He had not moved closer. He had not tried to explain himself. He simply watched the grounded aircraft with the quiet patience of someone who had spent years listening to machines speak in their own language. Corporal Ryan Mercer forced out a nervous scoff. Lucky guess. But even he no longer sounded convinced. One of the civilian engineers stood up quickly and looked toward Ethan. "Sir," he called carefully, "how did you know that?" Ethan glanced toward the drone again. Startup pulse sounded uneven. The engineer frowned. "You heard that?" Ethan nodded once. Bird was trying to compensate. Silence followed the words. The kind of silence that made people suddenly aware of every sound around them. The hiss of rain outside. The distant whine of generators. The low electrical hum vibrating through the hangar ceiling. Briggs watched Mercer carefully. The young Marine's confidence was beginning to crack around the edges now. Not because he believed the old man completely. Worse. Because he no longer knew what to believe. A red warning light blinked slowly above the drone control station before fading back to green. Technicians hurried toward the relay housing with fresh tools while maintenance supervisors began speaking in lower, tighter voices. The energy inside the hangar had shifted from irritation to caution. Ethan reached down calmly and adjusted the old canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. The movement exposed a small worn leather pouch attached near the strap by faded stitching. Briggs noticed it instantly. The leather was cracked from age, darkened by years of heat, sand, and sweat. Something about it looked ancient. Personal. The kind of object men carried through entire wars without replacing. One of the younger Marines noticed it too. Lance Corporal Tyler Reed stepped forward with nervous curiosity replacing his earlier mockery. "What is that thing?" he asked. Ethan looked down briefly at the pouch. His expression changed almost too subtly to notice. Not sadness exactly. Memory. "Tool kit," he answered quietly. Reed smirked awkwardly. "That old thing." Before Briggs could stop him, the young Marine reached toward the pouch and brushed his fingers lightly against the worn leather. The instant contact happened, Ethan's eyes unfocused for half a second. The fluorescent lights vanished. The cold Texas rain disappeared. Suddenly the air smelled of burning sand and overheated electronics beneath a black desert sky. Red emergency floodlights flickered across rows of unfinished drone prototypes parked along a temporary airstrip somewhere far from maps. Generators rumbled through the darkness while radio chatter cracked sharply across secured frequencies. Young Ethan Cole stood beneath whipping rotor wash beside a crude control terminal built from salvaged equipment and military desperation. His hands moved across glowing green monitors while warning sirens echoed across the base perimeter. Storm. Front moving east, somebody shouted through static. Satellite feed dropping. Another voice answered immediately. Reaper team is still online. Ethan looked up toward the black horizon where distant lights flickered beyond the desert heat. Calm. Focused. Tireless. A name echoed through the command tent behind him. Reaper Storm has target lock. The memory shattered instantly beneath another crash of thunder outside Hangar 12. Ethan blinked once and returned to the present. Rainwater dripped steadily from the open hangar doors while technicians rushed around the partially revived aircraft. Reed slowly pulled his hand back from the leather pouch without understanding why his pulse suddenly felt too fast. Briggs stared at Ethan with growing certainty now. Somewhere above them, deep inside the secure operations wing overlooking the hangar floor, a classified alert had just reached the desk of a 4-star general. The rain outside intensified until it sounded like handfuls of gravel thrown against the steel roof of Hangar 12. Water streamed down the massive doors in silver sheets while floodlights painted the runway in pale white reflections. Inside the hangar, nobody was laughing anymore. Technicians moved faster now, speaking in clipped voices as diagnostic screens flickered green across the maintenance bay. The damaged relay housing sat exposed beneath the drone's intake assembly, surrounded by tools and open manuals that suddenly looked useless beside the quiet old man standing near the cargo crates. Corporal Ryan Mercer tried to recover the confidence slipping from his voice. "Okay," he muttered, forcing a shrug. So he guessed one mechanical issue. Big deal. But even he could hear the weakness in his own words now. Staff Sergeant Noah Briggs did not answer immediately. His eyes remained fixed on Ethan Cole with growing unease. The old veteran stood perfectly still beneath the harsh fluorescent lights, one hand resting lightly against the faded canvas bag hanging from his shoulder. He looked more like a tired traveler than a man who had just diagnosed a classified combat drone by sound alone. That was the part Briggs could not shake. Real experts usually wanted recognition. They explained themselves. They corrected people. Ethan did none of those things. He simply observed. Quietly. Like someone who had spent a lifetime surviving by noticing details other people ignored. One of the civilian engineers hurried toward the maintenance station holding a thermal scanner. He was right, the man announced breathlessly. The relay temperature spikes 38 degrees during ignition transfer. Several technicians exchanged stunned looks. Another engineer glanced toward Ethan with open disbelief. How could anybody hear that from outside the aircraft? Ethan did not answer. He kept watching the drone instead. The pale gray machine rested beneath the gantry lights with its wings casting long shadows across the concrete floor. The aircraft no longer looked dead now. It looked wounded. Briggs stepped closer to Mercer and lowered his voice carefully. "You need to stop treating this man like some drifter." Mercer frowned hard. "And you need to stop acting like he is a ghost story." Briggs leaned closer. "You ever wonder why certain old records disappear from military databases?" Mercer rolled his eyes immediately. "Here we go. I am serious." Briggs glanced toward Ethan before continuing. There were programs after Desert Storm that operated completely outside conventional command structures. Experimental drone warfare. Black Channel reconnaissance. Unmanned strike coordination before the Pentagon even admitted half the technology existed. Mercer crossed his arms tighter. And this homeless old man was secretly running all of it. Briggs looked toward the exposed relay housing where engineers still worked frantically around the drone. "I do not know," he admitted quietly. But I know what I heard. The overhead speakers crackled suddenly with static before falling silent again. Somewhere above the hangar floor, security doors opened with heavy metallic thuds. Briggs noticed immediately. So did Ethan. The old veteran's eyes lifted briefly toward the upper observation level overlooking the maintenance bay. His expression did not change, but something sharpened behind his pale blue eyes. He knew. Mercer followed his gaze upward. "What now?" he muttered. No one answered him. At the far side of the hangar, Lance Corporal Tyler Reed approached Ethan cautiously, still unsettled by the strange flash of memory that had crossed the old man's face earlier. "Sir," Reed asked carefully, "what exactly was Reaper Storm?" Ethan remained silent for several seconds. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while cold wind curled through the open hangar entrance behind him. Finally he spoke. "A storm does not ask permission before it arrives." Reed blinked. "That does not answer the question." Ethan looked toward the drone once more. "No," he said quietly. "It does not." The answer somehow unsettled Reed even more. Before anyone could speak again, a sharp electronic tone echoed across the entire hangar. Every maintenance screen instantly froze. Conversation stopped. Then one by one, security monitors across the bay switched to the same message in bright red letters. Priority command authorization active. Several engineers stepped back in confusion. Mercer stared upward as heavy footsteps began moving along the overhead observation corridor. Dark silhouettes appeared behind the reinforced glass overlooking the hangar floor. Officers. Senior officers. More than should have been awake at this hour. Briggs felt his stomach tighten. Because now it was no longer just suspicion. The command structure had recognized the name. The entire atmosphere inside Hangar 12 tightened like a cable pulled too far. Red authorization warnings continued flashing across maintenance screens while engineers stepped away from their terminals in growing confusion. Above the hangar floor, silhouettes moved quickly behind the reinforced observation glass. Senior officers. Communications personnel. Security command staff. Men who normally never appeared during midnight maintenance operations unless something had gone very wrong. Or very important. Rain pounded against the steel roof hard enough to rattle the overhead beams. Beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting, Ethan Cole remained motionless beside the cargo crates, one hand resting lightly against the old leather pouch attached to his canvas bag. He looked small compared to the massive drone looming behind him. Small. Quiet. Ordinary. Yet somehow every set of eyes inside the hangar kept drifting back toward him. Corporal Ryan Mercer tried one last time to regain control of the situation. "This is ridiculous," he muttered, glancing between the warning screens and the old veteran. "Somebody probably tripped a classified keyword protocol. That does not make him special." Nobody answered him. Staff Sergeant Noah Briggs stared upward toward the observation corridor as two Air Force officers hurried past the glass carrying tablets against their chests. One of them stopped suddenly mid-stride and looked directly down toward Ethan before continuing faster than before. Briggs felt cold pressure settle in his stomach. He had seen that look before during deployments overseas. The look officers got when they suddenly realized somebody important had entered the room without warning. Near the drone, one of the civilian engineers completed the relay replacement and called toward the startup station. Attempting ignition cycle again. The maintenance crew stepped back as warning lights along the drone's fuselage flickered amber. A low electronic whine echoed through the hangar while internal systems slowly powered online. The aircraft trembled faintly. Then the startup cycle failed again. Several technicians cursed under their breath. Pressure spike moved to secondary transfer line, one engineer snapped. That should not even be possible. Ethan's voice came quietly from behind them. Because your calibration timing is late by half a second. The lead technician turned sharply. Excuse me. Ethan nodded toward the drone's left-wing route. You replaced the damaged relay, but the startup sequence is still compensating for the old failure pattern. The technician frowned. That system resets automatically. Ethan slowly shook his head. Not after thermal desync. The engineer hesitated. Mercer let out an exhausted laugh. You are seriously listening to him now? But nobody looked at Mercer anymore. The lead technician walked back toward the console and adjusted the startup timing sequence manually. Around the hangar, conversations stopped again. Rain hammered the runway outside. Hydraulic pumps hissed softly somewhere beneath the maintenance platform. Then the drone powered up. The aircraft's internal systems surged alive in one smooth, uninterrupted sequence. Navigation lights blinked steady green. Cooling fans spun beneath the fuselage. The low electronic hum rolling through the hangar floor sounded almost alive. Several engineers stared at the active drone in disbelief. One of them whispered softly, "That fixed it." Another technician looked directly at Ethan now with something dangerously close to fear. Mercer's face tightened. "No," he muttered quietly. "No way." Ethan barely reacted. He simply watched the drone stabilize beneath the overhead lights while rainwater dripped slowly from the edge of his old parka onto the concrete below. The sound of approaching footsteps suddenly echoed across the upper observation corridor. Heavy. Fast. Purposeful. A secure elevator door opened above the hangar floor with a sharp metallic thud. Four armed security personnel emerged first, scanning the area immediately. Behind them came a gray-haired colonel wearing a dark weatherproof field jacket over his uniform. The moment he stepped onto the observation platform and saw Ethan Cole below, he stopped walking entirely. Complete stillness. The colonel's face changed in an instant. Not confusion. Recognition. Deep and immediate. Briggs saw the exact moment it happened. The officer removed his glasses slowly as though trying to confirm what he was seeing. Then he spoke into the secure radio clipped near his collar. His voice came low and tight. "This is Colonel Avery. Confirm visual identification immediately." A pause followed. The colonel kept staring downward at Ethan without blinking. "No," he said quietly into the radio. "You do not understand. He is actually here." The overhead lights reflected faintly in Ethan's pale blue eyes as he looked up toward the observation deck. For the first time all night, the old veteran seemed tired in a different way. Not exhausted from years on the street. Exhausted from being remembered. The drone systems continued humming steadily above the hangar floor, smooth. Now for the first time in nearly 7 hours. Green operational lights reflected across polished concrete while technicians stood frozen around the aircraft like men witnessing something they could not fully explain. Outside, the Texas storm rolled across the runway in waves of cold rain and distant thunder. But inside Hangar 12, the real pressure no longer came from the weather. It came from the old man standing quietly beside the cargo crates while senior officers gathered above him in stunned silence. Colonel Avery descended from the observation level with 2 armed security personnel moving several paces behind him. He walked quickly at first, then slower as he approached Ethan Cole. The colonel's face looked pale beneath the harsh fluorescent lighting. Not afraid exactly. Reverent. The kind of expression soldiers wore when confronting something larger than themselves. Around the hangar floor, conversations died completely. Corporal Ryan Mercer stared in disbelief as the senior officer stopped only a few feet from Ethan. "Sir," Avery said carefully. The single word landed harder than shouting ever could. Mercer blinked immediately. Briggs lowered his eyes toward the concrete floor because he suddenly understood what was happening before everyone else did. Ethan looked up slowly at the colonel. Rainwater still dripped from the edge of his parka sleeves. "Been a long time, Daniel," he said quietly. Avery exhaled sharply at the sound of his first name. "I was hoping the database was wrong," he admitted softly. Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. It rarely is. The colonel glanced toward the active drone behind them before lowering his voice further. You should not be here. Ethan's pale blue eyes drifted back toward the aircraft. Neither should half the things inside this hangar. Several technicians exchanged uneasy looks. Mercer frowned harder. Hold on, he interrupted. Can somebody explain what is happening? Avery turned slowly toward the young Marine. The coldness in the colonel's expression hit harder than any raised voice. Corporal, he said evenly, how long have you been assigned to base security? Mercer straightened instinctively. 8 months, sir. Avery nodded once. Then you were still in middle school when men like him changed aerial warfare permanently. Silence crashed across the hangar again. Mercer opened his mouth to respond, but no words came out. Ethan remained completely calm through all of it. That seemed to disturb Mercer more than the colonel's tone. Most men would have enjoyed the moment. They would have defended themselves. They would have demanded respect after humiliation. Ethan did none of those things. He simply looked tired. Avery's secure radio crackled sharply against his collar. A voice spoke too quietly for anyone else to hear. The colonel listened for several seconds before answering with visible tension tightening his jaw. Understood, he replied. Yes, sir. He is standing directly in front of me. Briggs noticed Avery's posture shift instantly after the transmission ended. Straighter. Tighter. Like a man preparing for inspection. The colonel looked back toward Ethan carefully. General Hale is on his way. Every technician within earshot stiffened immediately. Even Mercer recognized the name. Four-star command authority did not personally respond to midnight maintenance issues. Not unless the situation threatened national security. Or involved somebody history was not supposed to forget. Ethan closed his eyes briefly at the mention of the general. Just for a second. Long enough for Briggs to catch the exhaustion hidden underneath the old veteran's calm exterior. Victor always did move too fast, Ethan murmured quietly. Avery almost laughed despite himself. Sir, he said carefully, with respect, half the Pentagon thought you were dead. Ethan opened his eyes again and looked toward the storm beyond the hangar doors. Sometimes, he answered softly, that is easier for everybody. The words settled heavily across the room. No arrogance. No drama. Just an old truth carried too long. Behind them, the drone completed another clean diagnostic cycle. Engineers watched the stable readings in stunned silence while hydraulic systems hummed smoothly through the aircraft's frame. One young technician whispered under his breath, he brought it back online like it was. Nothing. Briggs looked toward Ethan again. No. Not nothing. The old veteran had not repaired a machine tonight. He had awakened ghosts. The storm over the runway deepened into a low roaring wall of rain and thunder that shook the steel skeleton of Hangar 12 every few minutes. Inside, the massive drone rested fully powered beneath cold fluorescent lights, its systems now running with smooth mechanical precision. The steady electronic hum rolling through the aircraft sounded almost alive. Yet nobody inside the hangar seemed focused on the machine anymore. Every eye kept returning to Ethan Cole. The old veteran stood quietly beside the cargo crates while officers, engineers, and Marines circled the edges of the scene with the uneasy caution people used around live explosives. Colonel Avery remained near Ethan, posture rigid despite the exhaustion lining his face. Secure radio chatter continued crackling softly from the communications teams above the observation level. More personnel had arrived over the last 10 minutes. Intelligence officers. Base command staff. 2 men from operations security wearing civilian jackets and expressions carved from stone. Nobody spoke loudly anymore. Even the younger Marines had lowered their voices without realizing it. Corporal Ryan Mercer stood near the hangar entrance with his arms folded tightly across his chest, trying to understand how the homeless old man he had mocked less than an hour earlier had somehow become the center of a command-level lockdown. He glanced toward Briggs again. "You seriously telling me this guy helped invent drone warfare?" Briggs kept watching Ethan. "I think I am telling you he survived it." Mercer frowned. "That does not even make sense." Briggs finally looked at him. "You think these systems started in clean laboratories with PowerPoint briefings?" He gestured toward the drone humming beneath the lights. "Everything in this hangar exists because somebody tested it when it was dangerous, unfinished, and half impossible." Mercer looked back toward Ethan uncertainly. The old veteran did not look legendary. That was the problem. He looked worn down by too many winters. His parka sleeves were frayed. His boots were cracked from years of hard miles. There was no rank on him. No medals. No visible proof of importance. Only that impossible calm that now seemed to make everyone around him nervous. Near the maintenance station, Lance Corporal Tyler Reed quietly approached one of the civilian engineers. "What exactly did this program do?" he whispered. The engineer hesitated before answering. "Early autonomous target tracking. Long-range surveillance coordination. Remote strike guidance." Reed frowned. "That sounds normal now." The engineer nodded slowly. "Now it does." Rainwater rattled violently against the upper hangar windows as another burst of thunder rolled overhead. Ethan looked briefly toward the storm outside, and for a fleeting second his pale blue eyes reflected something far away. Not fear. Memory. The harsh fluorescent lighting dissolved into dim red emergency lamps glowing across a desert operations tent decades earlier. Heat shimmered above rows of prototype equipment while generators rattled endlessly through the blackness beyond the perimeter fences. Young Ethan sat alone before a bank of unstable monitors, headphones pressed against one ear while static crackled across encrypted channels. Fuel smoke mixed with dust and overheated circuitry inside the cramped command shelter. Signal drift increasing, a nervous operator warned nearby. "Satellite lock is unstable." Ethan never looked away from the screen. "Keep the relay alive another 30 seconds. That storm front is killing visibility." Ethan's eyes tracked a flickering target box moving across grainy infrared imagery. Calm. Focused. Tireless. Outside the tent, warning sirens echoed through the desert darkness while distant lights disappeared beneath rolling sand clouds. Another voice burst through the radio static. "Command wants to abort." Ethan answered immediately. "Negative." Silence followed. Then a quieter voice came back over the channel. "Reaper storm maintaining control." The memory vanished beneath the sharp hiss of hydraulic systems cycling inside Hangar 12. Ethan blinked once and returned to the present. Across the hangar floor, several officers had noticed the expression crossing his face. Colonel Avery noticed too. The old veteran looked older suddenly. Heavier somehow. Like each remembered year carried physical weight inside him. Then the overhead security speakers crackled alive across the entire hangar. Every conversation stopped instantly. A calm voice echoed through the building. "Attention all personnel. 4-star command arrival in 2 minutes." Nobody moved after the announcement. Because now the entire base understood exactly who the old man was. The announcement echoed across Hangar 12 like the final crack of thunder before a storm breaks open. 4-star command arrival in 2 minutes. Then silence returned. Heavy. Absolute. Even the technicians working around the drone slowed instinctively, their tools suddenly sounding too loud against the concrete floor. The aircraft systems continued humming smoothly beneath the fluorescent lights, but now the entire hangar felt frozen around the old veteran standing beside the cargo crates. Ethan Cole remained motionless, one hand resting lightly against the worn canvas strap over his shoulder. His pale blue eyes drifted toward the runway outside where sheets of rain blurred the floodlights into pale silver halos. He did not look nervous. He did not look proud. He looked like a man who had already lived through too many arrivals like this. Colonel Avery stepped closer to him carefully. "Sir," he said quietly, "you should probably come inside the secure briefing area before the general arrives." Ethan shook his head once. "No," Avery hesitated. "With respect, there are protocols." Ethan almost smiled at that. "There always are." The colonel lowered his voice further. "Victor Hale is not coming down here as a commander tonight." Ethan finally looked at him directly. Avery swallowed before continuing. "He is coming as one of the last people alive who remembers what happened." Across the hangar floor, Corporal Ryan Mercer stood completely still. The words hit him harder than any formal reprimand could have. 1 hour earlier he had mocked the old man sitting in the rain outside the hangar doors. Now a 4-star general was personally driving through a thunderstorm. To see him. Briggs noticed Mercer's expression changing minute by minute. The arrogance was gone now. Replaced by something far worse. Shame. Outside, the growing howl of approaching engines rolled faintly across the runway. Headlights appeared through the rain beyond the perimeter fencing. Black SUVs moved slowly toward the hangar in a tight convoy formation, their tires throwing water across the flooded concrete. The entire maintenance crew watched silently as the vehicles approached. Nobody had to be ordered to stand straighter. They simply did. A cold gust of wind swept through the open hangar doors, carrying rain mist and jet fuel fumes deep into the building. Ethan closed his eyes briefly as the scent hit him. For half a second the modern hangar disappeared again beneath the weight of memory. Red emergency lights flickered across another storm decades earlier. Not rain this time. Desert dust hammered against reinforced canvas command tents while generators rattled endlessly in the darkness. Young Ethan stood alone beside a primitive drone control station, headphones pressed tightly against his ears while unstable video feeds danced across green-tinted monitors. Every system around him vibrated from overloaded power. Satellite relay collapsing, an operator shouted nearby. "We are losing visual." Ethan leaned closer toward the grainy screen. Calm. Focused. Tireless. Somewhere beyond the black desert horizon, aircraft waited for coordinates that only he could still provide. Another voice crackled across the radio. "Command says abort immediately." Ethan never looked away from the monitor. "Negative. You are flying blind now." Ethan's eyes tracked movement hidden inside static and interference. "No," he answered softly. "I know where they are." The memory shattered beneath the sound of vehicle doors opening outside Hangar 12. Ethan blinked once and returned to the present. Rain swept sideways across the runway as armed security personnel moved quickly around the arriving convoy. Then General Victor Hale stepped out into the storm. Tall despite his age. Gray-haired. 4 stars gleaming faintly beneath the runway lights. He did not hurry. He simply walked through the rain toward the hangar entrance while security officers struggled to keep pace behind him. The moment he crossed into the fluorescent light of Hangar 12, the entire building instinctively snapped to attention. Boots struck concrete in perfect unison. Conversations vanished completely. Even the drone's mechanical hum suddenly seemed quieter. General Hale stopped just inside the hangar doors. Water dripped slowly from his field coat onto the concrete floor. His eyes moved past every officer, every Marine, every technician in the room until they finally settled on Ethan Cole standing beside the cargo crates. For several long seconds, the general said nothing at all. Then the 4-star commander of the entire operation stood perfectly straight and rendered the old homeless veteran the sharpest salute anyone inside that hangar had ever seen. The salute hung in the air longer than thunder. Inside Hangar 12, nobody moved. Hundreds of eyes locked onto General Victor Hale standing rigid beneath the fluorescent lights, rainwater still dripping from the edges of his field coat onto the concrete floor. 4 silver stars gleamed faintly against the storm shadows behind him. Yet his attention remained fixed entirely on Ethan Cole. The old veteran looked at the salute quietly for several seconds before slowly returning it. Not sharp. Not ceremonial. Just respectful. Familiar. Like a gesture shared between men who had survived the same long road. Around the hangar, Marines and technicians stood frozen in stunned silence. Corporal Ryan Mercer felt heat rising into his face despite the cold air sweeping through the building. Less than 2 hours earlier he had treated the old man like a trespasser. Now the commanding general of the entire operation stood before him with visible respect in his eyes. General Hale lowered his hand slowly. For a moment the 2 old men simply looked at each other across the polished concrete floor while the steady hum of the drone rolled softly through the hangar behind them. Finally the general spoke. "You disappeared." Ethan gave a tired shrug beneath the faded parka. "War ended." Hale's expression tightened slightly. "Not for the rest of us." A faint, almost invisible smile touched Ethan's face before fading again. The general stepped closer now, ignoring every officer around him. "Do you know how many systems in this country still run on frameworks you designed?" Ethan glanced toward the active drone. "Looks like they finally improved the wiring." Several nervous laughs escaped from the technicians before dying quickly in the heavy atmosphere. Hale shook his head softly. "Still the same man." He turned slowly toward the gathered personnel inside the hangar. Engineers. Security teams. Young Marines. Intelligence officers. Men and women who had spent the last hour trying to understand who the quiet homeless veteran really was. The general's voice carried across the hangar floor with calm authority. 30 years ago, he said, before autonomous aerial warfare officially existed, this man built operational doctrine from scraps, failing prototypes, and pure instinct while deployed in places most records still refuse to acknowledge. Nobody moved. Hale pointed toward the drone humming behind them. Every pilot operating remotely from a secure chair today, he continued, every autonomous targeting system in this building, every survival protocol tied into these aircraft traces back to Ethan Cole. Mercer felt his stomach sink lower with every word. Around him, Marines who had mocked the old veteran earlier now stared at Ethan with open disbelief. The general looked back toward Ethan again. "You saved programs that entire defense committees wanted buried." Ethan's pale blue eyes drifted toward the storm outside the hangar doors. "Most of them barely worked." Hale almost laughed quietly at that. "Neither did we." The rain softened outside at last, fading into a steady whisper against the runway. Inside the hangar, the drone completed another flawless systems cycle. Green operational lights reflected softly across the polished concrete floor. One of the engineers stepped forward carefully. "Sir," he asked Ethan quietly, "why never come back?" Ethan remained silent for a long moment. The fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead while cold air curled through the open hangar doors behind him. Finally he answered. "Because eventually machines stopped needing the men who built them." Nobody had a response to that. The word settled across the hangar with the weight of truth carried too many years alone. General Hale removed his gloves slowly and looked around the room one final time. "Tonight," he said calmly, "every person in this building witnessed living history and almost failed to recognize it." His eyes stopped briefly on Corporal Mercer. Not angry. Worse. Disappointed. Mercer lowered his gaze immediately. Hale turned back toward Ethan and motioned gently toward the secure operations corridor. "Come inside," he said quietly. "There are people upstairs who have wanted to shake your hand for 30 years. Ethan looked toward the active drone one last time. The aircraft hummed steadily beneath the harsh white lights, alive again after hours of failure. Then he adjusted the old canvas bag over his shoulder and followed the general across the hangar floor. Nobody spoke as the 2 old men walked past. Marines stood straighter. Technicians stepped aside silently. The storm outside continued fading into the Texas night while the low mechanical hum of the drone echoed softly behind them like a machine paying respect. And long after the hangar doors finally closed, Corporal Ryan Mercer would remember one thing more clearly than anything else from that night. The most powerful man on the base had not saluted the uniform. He had saluted the man history almost forgot.